All right. Well, hello, everyone, and greetings from wherever you are coming in and joining us from around the globe. This webinar is provided by ENSULIB, the Environmental Sustainability and Library section. And today is an interactive one. Hopefully you can stay the 90 minutes, and we're going to have several breakout sessions on the topic of this MACK framework, mitigation, adaptation, community knowledge, a model that perhaps can be used for situating climate action within the local library context. My name is Beth Filer Williams. I am a member of the Standing Committee for ENSULIB, and I'm a user experience research librarian at Oregon State University. I'm co-facilitating who's helping with tech behind the scenes, and the question and answer at the end is Vivian Bird, who's a citizen science initiative librarian at Los Angeles Public Library. So just before we begin, I have a couple notes on privacy to share. This webinar is being recorded, but only the main intro, the breakout rooms should not be recorded. We'll be posting it on YouTube afterwards. The microphones have been muted, and then you can use the chat to chat with each other like you're doing now. We ask if you have actual questions, please put them in the Q&A so that we can make sure we get to them. So for our opening welcome, I'd like to introduce Harry Sahavierta, who is the chair of ENSULIB's section and chief librarian at Helsinki City Library.
Good evening from Helsinki, and I guess this is to say good morning for most of you. As the chair of ENSULIB, IFLA's Environmental, Sustainability and Library section, I have the honor and joy to open this webinar on MACK framework. I'm very happy to see that there is so many colleagues around the world interested in this subject. There will be no IFLA Flick conference this year, but nevertheless, our section has been and will be active. Last summer, ENSULIB won the Dynamic Unit and Active Impact Prize, and at the moment, IFLA Green Library Award competition is going on. You still have time to leave your submission. Furthermore, our latest newsletter is out, and our webinar for 2024 is just about to begin. That's why we are here. This workshop will introduce you a tool, the mitigation adaptation community knowledge, that is MACK, conceptual model for situating climate action within local library context. And it's certainly going to be interesting. I wish to thank you, the coordinators of today's session, Beth and Vivian, along with our presenter, Dan Hackborn, who is a member of the Canadian Federation of Library Associations Climate Action Committee. And now the floor is yours, and I hope you all will enjoy the webinar.
Well, thank you so much, Harry. And I have the honor to introduce Dan Hackborn. You can read a little about him on the screen. He's going to be facilitating this webinar today. I met Dan at IFLA in Rotterdam. Well, actually not in Rotterdam, but the ENSULIB satellite meeting that we had in Tilburg in August, which, by the way, is an amazing green library. If you haven't been there, go visit. He facilitated this workshop there, and we wanted to share his work and his ideas more broadly by offering this webinar. It's going to include breakout sessions. Hopefully that'll give you some time to discuss. And without further ado, I'm going to just let him jump right in. Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, thank you. Just give me a second to share the presentation. So, this vocational and historical moment that we've arrived at on the threshold of a global temperature average 1.5 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial challenges us to consider what librarianship must look like in the context of a changing climate, rather than merely what climate action looks like within a library. How do we become climate institutions while maintaining the core purpose of what we do? So while keeping that big picture in mind today, I'll be offering some help wayfinding at the local level. It is not exactly a how-to or a comprehensive list of climate actions that your institution can take, as there are already excellent online resources that go into better detail along those lines, notably Rebecca Smith-Aldrich's and Era Tanzi's. Instead, I'm offering a framework that I hope might prove useful for what Luann Cinnamon and Lisa Nathan are calling our collective vocational sense-making around climate change. Individually, there will likely be topics discussed that you already know or are more knowledgeable about than I. This is a method for connecting them and maybe presenting some in a new light. To that end, during the next hour and a half, we'll be looking at our work in a context, using why and where as a foundation for what and how. I'll position myself prior to getting into the MACK framework by briefly introducing the characteristics that name it before getting into the 4 quadrants of climate librarianship that they outline. We'll have several 5-minute breaks to talk through things and discuss the framework in our own contexts. Throughout, I'll be providing examples from my own home as a guide to clarify or catalyze these discussions. That home is Treaty 6 and Musqueam, Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Here you can see some of the other Indigenous names and ways it might be described ecologically, though there are a lot of words to say that it is landlocked, dry, sunny, and cold most of the year. It is also the rightful and ancestral land of nations, including the Niitsitapi Blackfoot Confederacy, the Dene, the Hohe Nakota Assiniboine, the Yahe Nakota Sioux, the Naga Wiwinawig Saulteaux, the Otipemisiwag Métis, and the Nehiyaw Cree. My name is Dan, and I myself am a settler, even as my perspective and knowledges are situated here, inescapably shaped by the environment to which I belong. I work in a library makerspace, and I'm a graduate student. My studies have been focused on the intersection between library work and transformative climate action. I've studied and done minor work in climate policy. I've been involved in on-the-ground climate activism at different points in my life. And this ties into the climate justice lens I'll be using, the perspective that all of this has been inequitably distributed, and therefore climate action should prioritize those facing the most severe impacts of climate change and those that have had the least responsibility in causing it. Climate change is a natural complement to library work, or climate justice rather, concerned as it often is with just and equitable distribution of knowledge and information. To develop this framework, I worked from this definition of libraries. I've intentionally kept it open-ended, like I said, to keep the focus on why we do what we do rather than what we do. I won't get into the weeds on a definition of community and knowledge. Instead, I'll ask you to project your own understanding onto this intersection. What community do you serve? What body of knowledge do you provide access to? As I just alluded to, I believe expressing our values through our labor is a natural part of the work. While the exact articulation of ethics may be contested, the aspiration is integral, whether that means the IFLA code or the model that I attempt to center, ethical relationality, which I was introduced to by Papas Chase Cree professor Dwayne Donald and Cree Métis librarian Jesse Lawyer, and in this specific tradition is drawn from 2 Cree concepts, Mio Wichihidowin and Mio Wakotowin, that come from the place that I'm fortunate enough to live in. This definition then covers the C, community, and the K, knowledge, of the MACK framework, a tool for clarifying the role of libraries within the context of climate change. Because it is difficult, probably impossible to truly understand as an individual. Anthropogenic global warming. It's very easy to get lost in the vastness of the planetary ecosystem, deep geological time, the threat of extinctions, the incredible complexity of a process influenced by ecological, economic, and sociopolitical forces. I'm not going to read off a litany of the doom statistics, but we're concerned with cultural records, so let's consider for a moment what those records say about the impact of rapid environmental changes on complex societies, even leaving aside our role in this one or its scale. You may feel similarly overwhelmed when faced with the scale of what is being asked in order to solve what's often referred to as the greatest challenge of our time. Where do libraries fit in? What are concrete and practical ways to change systems in order to avert the worst? And what does this systemic change look like applied to our own practice? As Harry wrote a few years back, there is still a need to clarify the concept of the sustainable library, and I've found that this applies to climate librarianship too. So that brings us to this sense-making tool. It's intended to be straightforward enough to connect climate actions between macro and micro scales, enabling us to see ourselves in this work rather than siloing it in the domain of jargon and policymakers. We've started simply enough from community and knowledge in order to keep things flexible enough to be useful in different local and institutional contexts, avoiding the kind of top-down planning that imposes generic strategies that fail to take the specific conditions and needs within those contexts into account. With that in mind, it is crucial to think about what the impacts and causes of climate change look like where you know from, on your land and in your community or institution, as a way to ground the macro scale terms on the other axis, taken from climate policy to refer to the primary methods that we have to meaningfully address our changing global climate. Mitigation, actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions or store them away from the atmosphere. Adaptation, actions that respond to actual or expected climate impacts, moderating harm or even leveraging benefits. The MACK framework cites libraries as the connector or the relationship between these elements: mitigation, adaptation, community, and knowledge, leaving us 4 quadrants of opportunity that fit directly within the scope of present-day library practice. Knowledge adaptation, maintaining the continuity of our knowledges and knowledge systems. Community adaptation, helping our community to navigate the locked-in impacts of climate change. Community-based mitigation in order to reduce the magnitude of those impacts as much as is possible. And knowledge-based mitigation, working to strengthen the connection between climate knowledge and taking collective climate action. I don't think it's necessary or even possible to fully pursue all 4 quadrants within one library. This is more of a tool for determining which areas you, your library, and your community have the greatest needs and capacities for as our world changes. All of these areas will be vital going forward, but depending on whether you work in a public library or an academic one, a national library, or one focused on a specific discipline, this will determine which quadrant or quadrants might align most with your institution or your interests. There is certainly crossover between them, but the usefulness of a framework is to clarify, even in a reductive way, without foreclosing complexity at a later stage in the process. Let's discuss the adaptation half of the framework to begin with, thinking through the implications of what this familiar graph abstracts. To start, I'd like you to consider these questions, and I will be bringing them back later to refer back to. Just now, I mentioned the connection between climate knowledge and action. So climate impacts are often presented like this, or the previous graph, displaying the annual global temperature anomaly fairly clinically. But what these quantitative shifts mean is another story. For instance, these numbers describe the perfect conditions for rapid wildfire growth. Wildfires and other extreme weather events are rapid onset impacts. Where I live, we've also been affected by heat domes, riverine flooding, seasonal drought, and abnormal storm activity. Disaster response in libraries addresses these sorts of rapid onset climate impacts, which many of you may have already experienced. For instance, I know the manager of a regional rural library who was told with barely an hour's notice that wildfire evacuees in the region were headed to use her library building as a regional evac center this past summer. Less well covered in library discussions are the slow onset impacts. These reflect changing overall conditions like sea level rise, or in my landlocked region, multi-year drought and deglaciation leading to water shortages projected during late summer. Knock-on effects are indirect, and they include the migration of species, biomes, and peoples outside their normal regions, or supply chain disruptions, increasing food costs, health problems caused by rapid or slow onset changes like wildfire smoke. For instance, Alberta might not be directly affected by sea level rise, but it will definitely be affected by the climate refugees so displaced. While specifics can't be easily modeled, we can still explore outcomes at a granular level. This map was developed by local post-secondary students to uncover intersections of vulnerability in local neighborhoods. A heat wave, for example, affects people to varying degrees based on factors like housing status or age, and neighborhoods aggregate material and demographic differences, expressing them as environmental inequality, connecting seemingly unrelated things like average household incomes, migratory statuses, air quality, and tree canopy coverage. Our institutions, embedded in the social fabric at this scale, are well suited to co-develop nuanced responses to climate impacts that address the diverse concerns and experiences of climate change within their precise locale. Systems can both prioritize branches based on expected impacts and vulnerabilities and tailor their responses to the specific needs of the surrounding community. This is a potential for subtlety of action that not many other public institutions have access to. Here, we'll go to our first breakout room to give you a chance to discuss the impacts that you are seeing and are likely to see in your own communities. We'll only have 5 minutes, so try and hear from everyone who wants to speak. If you would rather, feel free to put your thoughts into the chat. You do not have to answer every question listed. Pick one or a few that call to your group the most. And if you would please, Beth.
Okay, I think I sent everyone in a room, so you should be getting sent to breakout rooms now.
So let's move on to responses to these impacts. First off, supporting the adaptive capacities of the community that we're embedded in. You can have the most comprehensive and accessible collection in the world, but who is it for? Our embeddedness is a great starting point. Understanding how a given community might define successful adaptation to climate change is highly important in its pursuit. Libraries are special as a community's link with knowledge. They go both ways, providing knowledge to folks and providing the means for people to create knowledges. Rather than community members being passive research subjects, our spaces are perfect sites to co-create how they would define adaptive success. Think about what you just discussed during this quadrant: extreme weather event or natural disaster that you may have even experienced directly as a community member. What did the response look like overall, and how did this manifest in your library? Consider valuable services your institution does provide or could relatively easily provide during these impacts given, and this is key, preparation. For instance, this summer, urban libraries in my region often provided free library services, programming, and direct outreach to evacuees in branch or at evac centers. Rural or remote libraries may be even more important during these events due to a dispersed population and infrastructure. Libraries are the most visible and trusted public infrastructure in many places in Alberta and North America in general. Therefore, becoming informal or formal evac centers during crisis, critical infrastructure during disaster recovery that provides information and referral services, which we'll go into in knowledge adaptation, and useful as staging hubs and resource distribution centers. There is a lot of documentation regarding these roles during rapid onset short-term events. Unfortunately, while plans might exist for fires or events inside the building, a consistent theme is a lack of formal planning for these broader impacts ahead of time, with libraries often making do on an ad hoc basis. The sentiment, "we just help people," is a common refrain, but without formal planning, supports, and regular practice, this can lead to staff burnout and a drop in institutional capacities, especially if we consider an increasing frequency of these events. Time and again, since libraries are trusted community institutions embedded in the fabric of people's day-to-day lives, people seek them out during precarity. This happens naturally. People turn to libraries and library workers are called to help, and this is a good thing. So how can that relationship be made as intentional and effective as possible? And not only does this happen during extreme weather events, but we can see the contours of the pattern occurring during likely long-term slow onset and knock-on effects. Earlier, I mentioned climate migration. In a review conducted after 2015, many Swedish libraries found that they were a place where international migrants at that time naturally came to, even in the absence of any formal direction from border or immigration services. Sadly, during the best of times, a relatively stable and tight-knit community might still experience social tensions as newcomers arrive, let alone during the unpredictability and resource scarcity that will likely accompany climate change. Therefore, it is important that we are proactive in building social capital and cohesion. In fact, the social functions of public libraries are often the first thing discussed with respect to climate librarianship, as well as community adaptation and resilience, including Rebecca Smith-Aldrich's books and Eric Kleinenberg's. On the Canadian prairie, social capital has been specifically cited as a key feature for adaptation to climate impacts, a soft infrastructure that can exist within closely knit groups or between separate groups, or linking individuals or communities with the broader political, economic, and institutional structures of which they are a part. In this way, libraries support a rare combination of all of these different kinds of social capital. Now, social capital is not uniformly positive, and accounting for its limitations is necessary. In-group bonding can sometimes emphasize differences between groups or exacerbate historical inequalities. You'll have to navigate the strengths and limitations of your own community's social capital. Social capital is also highlighted by one of the dominant global adaptation paradigms, resilience. While there are limitations, it provides some useful benchmarks to discuss the concept. In the community resilience model, social capital exists in a network with 3 other adaptive capacities: economic development, having enough resources for a high quality of life plus equitable distribution of those resources; community competence, the capacity for both collective decision-making and the capacity to act on said decisions; and finally, information and communication, which we'll get to later in knowledge adaptation and mitigation quadrants. These capacities support overall community adaptation when they are made robust, that is resistant to disruption or degradation, redundant, situated in multiple interchangeable and interoperable parts or copies, and or rapidly available, another way of saying they're easy to use and deploy. The beauty of libraries is that in addition to soft infrastructure like social capital, programming, and sharing models, libraries are also hard infrastructure through their built environment, operational equipment, and material collections. We can support many of these adaptive capacities with this infrastructure as well. Which makes libraries an interesting comparison for this concept, resilience hubs. Now, recently, I was talking to someone who used to work in the international development sphere, and they remarked that sometimes folks in the field come up with a concept or initiative only to realize that they have sort of just invented the public library again. And I think that is a fascinating thing for us to mull over. This concept, resilience hubs, could either uncharitably fall under libraries again, but I think it also provides a potential lens to reimagine your library's future or clarify the adaptation infrastructure it already provides by serving as heating and cooling centers maybe, or providing refuge from air pollution, or serving as staging grounds for disaster response. Consider the differences at the neighborhood level again and the local impacts discussed earlier. If they are increasingly likely to happen, and people are almost certainly going to seek out your help when they do, in existing or novel arrangements, how can your built environment, collections, services, and programming support the unique and specific needs for social capital, resource distribution, collective governance, and or information infrastructure in their immediate vicinity? How can this adaptive library infrastructure be made robust, redundant, or rapidly available? And how might your library orient itself before, during, and after these impacts? Instead of a normal operations plus disaster plan model, one of the primary developers of the Resilience Hub concept, Christian Baha, advocates for having 3 states of operation: one for stability, another for disruption, and a third that contributes to recovery. And recovery doesn't need to mean anything Herculean either. It's been found that one of the most valuable facets of post-disaster library operations is the feeling of normalcy engendered by things like children's programming. We will break here for another 5-minute discussion to think through the ways that your library might support community adaptation. Last one. Information and communication. Or knowledge adaptation, adapting our knowledge and knowledge infrastructure for climate change. If you're wary of the idea that libraries should do more or take on more roles, which I fully admit is fair given chronic underfunding combined with what often seems to be an ever-expanding scope, then let us focus on knowledge comfortably within our wheelhouse. A lot of the most insightful discussion in this area comes unsurprisingly from archival professionals. There's two questions here, the content of collections and the material of collections. First, preserving everything is impossible. Regardless of your philosophical or moral beliefs around saving knowledge for posterity, cultural memory work is nothing if not a negotiation with practical limits, whether that's resources or space or time or labor, and that is during the relative stability that has existed up to now. So similar to consulting your community about the meaning of adaptation, how will you determine what knowledges they want to carry into the future? And are there any knowledges that might be specifically useful for community adaptation? Additionally, whose knowledges have been historically marginalized in your region? What is your duty to address this imbalance during a time when preserving any knowledge will become more difficult and important? And with respect to that, the second part, regardless of content, what are the media formats and distribution infrastructures that most lend themselves to being robust, redundant, and or rapidly available, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well? I mentioned earlier that libraries often provide information and referral resources to community members during and after crises. Information needs like these can be easier to assess than those big cultural questions. Now, not as many rapid onset short-term climate-related impacts on knowledge infrastructure are immediately apparent in my home, though yours may differ. And the question is not only what information to provide during rapid onset impacts, but how, potentially, given the vulnerabilities of existing knowledge infrastructures. Wireless service has been affected by flooding in Albertan cities within the last decade, but at this point in time, most of our recent critical outages have been down to private business failures, such as the nationwide network outages we've had in 2 consecutive years and the failure of private telecommunications companies to consistently distribute emergency alerts during our wildfires this summer. In Canadian rural and remote communities, these businesses have also not been effective at addressing an internet connectivity gap. Other tensions, such as the inaccessibility of scholarly publications, and as highlighted by the 2020 open letter that IFLA co-signed, the copyright issues interfering with the preservation of cultural heritage, highlight other examples that run counter to our mission of supporting cultural knowledge and memory in the context of climate change. Alternatives do exist, and I wonder about the ability of libraries to serve as incubators for further democratic deployments of technology, in addition to important ongoing initiatives like HathiTrust, the Internet Archive, and SolarSpell. Where I'm from, colonialism and its cultural epistemicide provides the most serious instance of slow onset threats to knowledge at scale. The threats posed by slow onset global warming impacts are a little fuzzier, partially due to the globally interconnected nature of contemporary knowledge infrastructures. Researchers like Aratanzi, the Barfords, and their peers have highlighted the threats rising sea levels pose to archival institutions and key internet sites. Canadian archivist Amanda Oliver found that every Canadian archive will be subject to increased heat and humidity stemming from climate change. In general, more regional geographic analyses comparing the locations of local knowledge institutions and infrastructure against climate impact projections will prove highly useful. A knock-on effect for digital ICT equipment would be supply chain issues. We've got a taste of this during the pandemic, and the impacts of climate change have the potential to exacerbate these disruptions, as seen in the tensions around water usage in Taiwanese semiconductor foundries. In light of these challenges, how do libraries ensure that their collections will remain accessible to their communities despite infrastructure disruption, data loss, changing environmental conditions, and power outages, Short-term is one thing, but long-term, especially climate long-term, is quite another. Here's a little thought experiment. Comparing climate timescales with the life expectancy of different knowledge media. The last IPCC report stated, what we do in the next 10 years will dictate the conditions for the next 10,000. With respect to resilient knowledge media, they do not necessarily need to possess all three adaptive characteristics, robustness, redundancy, and rapidity, in order to guarantee resilience, but it is worth considering whether our media are robust enough in light of the supply chain and infrastructure they require to produce. Not really talking about projects like the Arctic World Archive or experimental quartz and DNA data storage at this point in time, so much as methods by which the knowledge that our community needs on a day-to-day basis may be made accessible in a day-to-day way. Digital information is highly redundant, but a great deal of its material infrastructure is not robust nor rapidly available to many people, and the production of this infrastructure requires significant stable complexity. There are further challenges in the form of proprietary changes to file formats, hardware, cable standards, digital licensing subscriptions, not to mention unequal distribution of the network. Given how greenhouse gases like CO2 persist in the atmosphere, without significant mitigation, we'll be experiencing increased stressors on society for a long time, making our job more difficult. We'd be remiss if we didn't consider whether the methods by which we commonly store our collections are properly robust, redundant, and rapidly available on these timescales in these conditions, and whether we should be diversifying common formats in our collections. So with that, let us break to discuss knowledge adaptation. Ultimately, however, adaptation can only take us so far, and that is where the other half of the framework comes in. The best way to increase the odds of our adaptive success is by mitigating the overall disturbance that we'll have to adapt to. So let's turn to the causes of climate change. Given the way resources and technologies are globally distributed, there are some communities like mine who have built a quality of life by causing the climate crisis, adding an ethical obligation to act immediately, in addition to the basic survival one. And other than emissions, the other causation that I want to loop in here is climate denial or delay and malinformation, since that has played a central role in continuing climate change as well, and as a form of knowledge should be directly part of climate action plans in libraries. Returning to the physical causes for the moment, Canada is responsible for a disproportionate share of greenhouse gas emissions, especially when viewed per person. Despite having less than 0.5% of the global population, my country has contributed 2% of cumulative emissions. This percentage would undoubtedly be even higher if the supply chains responsible for the specific way that our standard of living is met hadn't been moved overseas by businesses in the late 20th century, offshoring the emissions associated with our lifestyle. This specific way of creating a standard of living has enormous and inefficient material and energy inputs, which we've arbitrarily distanced ourselves from through globalization. Local climate malinformation narratives then shame these countries in the supply chain for not doing their part and use it as justification to delay action here at home. These material and energy costs have further implications for other environmental crises, such as the biodiversity crisis and peak resource usage. It is also critical to recognize that emissions are, as is the case around the world, disproportionately caused by specific demographics within our communities as well, such as the ultra-wealthy. On the other hand, Indigenous communities in Canada have done very little to contribute to these totals. However, even in Canada, my region, Treaty 6 Alberta, creates an enormous amount of emissions. While climate and a widely dispersed population play some role, the real culprit is that our economy is structured around fossil fuels, with operations based in our northern tar sands creating emissions remarkable even in the primary industry responsible for global warming, an industry which also forms a large portion of our national GDP and supports a great deal of the local economy. For our part, residents of Emmiskwitchie, Waskahigan, Edmonton emit a lot as well, primarily through transport, industry, and providing heat and power to buildings. Again, this has to do with climate and the dispersed way that we have organized our way of life. Though our municipal government has made strides towards institutionalizing climate action, we are a long way from doing our part to limit global warming. Obviously, the city's libraries also create greenhouse gas emissions through their facilities and operations. Kate Elliott, a PhD candidate out west, has been conducting research focusing on these sources in libraries. And I believe the Sustainable Library Certification, as well as some local jurisdictions, also offer emissions auditing support for library institutions. Similar to the way that my society has offshored emissions, a further complication with assessing these sources in your own library may be accounting for the third-party vendors that your library has contracts with. Due to some of the socioeconomic factors I've just listed, Alberta is also the home of a large and well-organized climate denial movement. So well-organized, in fact, that it is often indistinguishable from the mainstream corporate and political establishment. In this discussion break, take some time to think through the emissions profile of your community and consider what kind of material and energy consumption it is predicated on and where the costs show up, either deferred into the future or to another community. Consider the local information environment. How do people talk about climate change? How do the media or local politicians talk about it? Where is blame allocated? Where is agency? So, how can we support our community's efforts individually and collectively to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and the climate malinformation? In a truly transformative sense, I think that this quadrant, community mitigation, can be one of the hardest to see our work in. While we should absolutely address our own operational emissions to the fullest extent possible, whether that means sustainable buildings, logistical infrastructure, and procurement policies, in the grand scheme of things, libraries do not typically produce a large proportion of community emissions nor directly address them. For instance, robust and renewably powered public transit is the best option for reducing transportation emissions equitably, and a renewably powered grid would take a large chunk out of the other sources of Edmonton's emissions. Yet, I believe that there are other ways we can meaningfully move the needle. If you remember the earlier chart displaying annual CO2 emissions, you may have noticed that the global emissions trajectory has only varied during massive loss of life, which is off the table for, I hope, obvious reasons, and severe economic downturn. I believe that the library model has the potential to form an integral part of a graceful, intentional economic degrowth, instead of the sudden, unintentional economic shocks that harm our communities. That chart illustrates that degrowth is the only significant post-industrial emissions reduction that there's historical precedent for, and is an avenue that is both particularly important in an overconsumptive community like my own, and supported by folks like Edgardo Civillero, one of the first people to bring it up in a library context, and Patricia Perkins, a lead author on the last IPCC mitigation report. In other writings, she actually goes further and calls for a recommoning movement. So one of the most important projects for libraries, public ones in particular, may be modeling ways of maintaining a high quality of life for everyone in the community while reducing the material and energy required. There are a few examples of these potential models currently practiced here in Amisquatchie, Waskagan, Edmonton, including tool libraries, toy libraries, and a growing food forest. At this point in time, they are relatively small grassroots initiatives, and none are currently part of the local public library system's collection. But in the same way that many folks have no need to own a book that they're going to only read once, limited use collections have the potential to more efficiently distribute tools or items that are inconvenient or nonsensical to purchase or own, reducing overall materials and energy. You might have heard the statistic that the average electric drill runs for 13 minutes during its lifespan, or been frustrated by purchasing shoes or clothes that a child is going to outgrow in a matter of months. As another example, many libraries now include makerspaces, which make maintenance and repair equipment, such as sewing machines and soldering stations, collectively accessible as part of their services, serving the double purpose of limited use tool collections and simultaneously lowering per item carbon impact by extending their usable life. If we are intentional, these sharing and circular initiatives have the potential to be scaled up or normalize everyday climate action in communities, either internally within the library or by offering your institution support to existing alternative collections and organizations. Now, it may be likely that in our current context, it would be either undesirable or impractical to recommon everything. There are, however, more ubiquitous needs that are worth discussing. In her writing on sustainability and resilience in libraries, Rebecca Smith-Aldrich suggests looking at the actual needs that we meet within our communities as a framework for seeing beyond what we think we do, to identify unrecognized services that we provide and gaps that we might meet relatively easily. To return to my city's emissions profile, given the geographic distribution of library branches, a bicycle commons could be a meaningful part of mitigating transportation emissions, though local climatic conditions like our winter would have to be taken into account. Not only might addressing some of these other needs more intentionally and collectively reduce material and energy inputs, some initiatives, like those focused on repair and reuse or seed libraries and community gardens, may also provide significant adaptive capacities in the community. With respect to the other part of mitigation, carbon storage, as an institution possessing a built environment, we often look to the construction and interior of our buildings for ways to reduce our impacts. But the built environment can also mean creating carbon sinks on our property through community gardens or renaturalization, or can also be paired with landscaping offering adaptive benefits, such as the Japanese disaster parks that serve as gathering points and staging areas during emergencies. In my community, we have replaced native plants with species possessing a lower carbon storage potential. Renaturalizing our buildings' outdoor spaces is a great first step in reducing emissions, one that some local branches have already taken. To go a step further, many of the indigenous communities on whose land I live are regional and world leaders in the adoption of renewables and ecological carbon capture. In addition to inheriting extensive legacies of community adaptation, such as dene, wildfire management regimes, and common resource governance, such as the Nietsitape giveaway ceremonies. Bringing things full circle, if we look at ecosystems like the Amazonian basin and the Coast Salish forest gardens a little closer to my home, acknowledging that these places were developed anthropo-collaboratively, we might recognize that a space where community members could find generative surpluses of knowledges, food, medicines, and other materials for cultural uses, all without monetary transactions taking place, could be seen as a highly advanced library. Not only do my region's libraries have a lot of work to do to support decolonialism, but I think that we have a lot to learn about our own practice. Particularly because widely practiced paradigms of demand-side climate action, which include sharing and circular economic models, are far from perfect. For example, focusing on individual consumer behaviors and ecological footprints shifts the onus away from corporations and existing infrastructure. Since libraries are positioned to meet collective rather than individual demand, I believe that does change the conversation somewhat. But libraries must be careful who they emulate, since often when businesses attempt a sharing economy, they aggressively and inefficiently overproduce in pursuit of disruption, market share, and profit, as well as exploiting precarious labor in the process. Another issue may arrive from Jevons paradox and induced demand. If these environmental initiatives have a narrow focus on increasing energy efficiency and decreasing associated costs, historically, this has every likelihood of leading to greater consumption overall. You can see it in the emissions intensity of the Albertan oil sands that I showed earlier, which decreases even as overall emissions from the sector rise. This has bearing on an aspect of the final quadrant, knowledge-based mitigation. But before that, let's take a moment to talk with each other about the opportunities for supporting our community or institutions' mitigation efforts. You may have noticed that the examples I went over in the previous quadrant, while important, do not address the largest source of emissions, the fossil fuel industry. And the question of eliminating those sources within my community, at least, is how do we build political will to shut down these high carbon industries or repurpose them into geothermal or carbon capture organizations while supporting the workers and communities currently dependent upon them? The question of building political will is a subvariation of one of the fundamental questions that both climate policy and our profession have dealt with throughout our histories. How does knowledge translate into action? Which brings us to the final quadrant, knowledge-based mitigation. Unlike the previous quadrant, this area is often the easiest for library work to be seen in, and yet, ironically, it might be the one we've approached in the least transformative manner. What does ethical knowledge work mean in the context of global warming and the way that it could have simply been an atmospheric physics and engineering problem and became one of, as Melissa Aronchik and Maria Espinoza put it, information, publicity, and politics? 2 years ago, one of the keynote speakers at the Dublin WLIC brought up Donella Meadows' idea of systemic leverage points, highlighting one for librarianship, changing information flows. What does this look like in the context of climate change? Now, knowledge-based mitigation may refer to materially changing information flows, that is, reducing or eliminating the emissions that our knowledge infrastructure creates. I mentioned Jevons paradox earlier, and the relative ease by which digital infrastructure lends itself to knowledge work and a broader information society at large has caused massive electricity consumption, even as these technologies have become more efficient and reduced emissions in other areas. The sense of knowledge-based mitigation is increasingly well studied, and there are more in-depth discussions of this aspect than we can cover in our remaining time. So rather, I'm hoping we can bring our experience as information professionals to bear on our community's knowledge environment to do a little institutional soul searching. In the IFLA survey that went out last year on climate action in libraries and in climate librarianship writing since the 90s, one thing that has remained evergreen is suggestions for books, programming, and other traditional authoritative information sources. All the book lists we create or the speakers we bring in, the information literacy we teach, it is all somewhat predicated on this information deficit model of scientific communication, or a one-way transmission of true knowledge from expert sources combined with a perception of people as rational receptacles. But this hasn't been reflective of the conditions shaping climate action and denial. Because depending on how you frame it, we've known about global warming and its serious implications since the late 19th century when the scientific discoveries of the mechanisms were made, the mid-20th century when government and industry were warned, or 35 years ago, public global mainstreaming seen in testimonies in the US Senate and the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Yet being informed is not the same as really deeply knowing something. Even given all of this information over all this time, we haven't permanently lowered our global emissions trajectory. You may have heard the idea that climate change is the largest ecological experiment ever conducted. I think it's also turned out to be a massive sociological experiment conclusively disproving the information deficit model at scale. In the Edmonton Declaration a couple of years back, a global meeting of urban mayors to discuss climate change, they called for better data for science-based decision-making. But maybe the issue at hand is not so much accumulating better data. We've been doing so constantly since this all began. The idea that individuals can evaluate an objective truth that knowledge is Darwinian, that more is always better, this is the realm of social media, where we can see the outline of the ways that power and accumulation shape data and discourse, though the process is increasingly obscured by algorithmic black boxes and interfaces. How might we instead, as ethical knowledge institutions, act to be a better or different relationship with information and knowledge? I think a lot about this quote by Abraham Gesner, the Canadian inventor of kerosene. He was referring to the fact that his invention replaced whale oil as the most common fuel for illumination. It was also one of the first profitable petroleum products of the carbon age. This demonstrates quite succinctly how even with the best intentions, a new technology may simply defer and displace environmental costs if there's no change in the logics and values that operate it. Consider the logics and values that we hold near and dear to our practice. How might they have fed into climate malinformation? In Canada, we've concerned ourselves with book bans, but often, not always, but often, ignored state and corporate censorship of climate science and impacts on environment and human health. Overall, the issue of corporate censorship is rarely addressed, though library organizations have made some statements about forms of it, such as intellectual property law and ebook licensing. Banning books is an easily recognized case of authoritarianism, but if what this is about is preventing the undue influence of power over knowledge and supporting equitable access to information, it is valid to be concerned about state censorship, but it also follows to be concerned about corporate censorship if said corporation wields similar power to that of a state. And if state censorship is a concern, then it is then worth considering state propaganda as another way in which the knowledge environment is manipulated by the powerful. And if both state propaganda and corporate censorship are concerning, then corporate propaganda bears consideration as well, such as promoting the dangers of climate action when your company has a clear understanding of the consequences of inaction. Should libraries take more of an active and effective role in combating this propaganda instead of offloading the responsibility onto individual community members, especially when power in the broader information environment is so unequally distributed? is teaching information literacy to our individual patrons in this case, not akin to promoting climate action through individual carbon footprints, whereby fossil fuel institutions and infrastructure are absolved of all responsibility. These institutions and small groups of powerful individuals have completely subverted the values of free expression to cause real and massive material harm. In over a dozen climate liability lawsuits, the propaganda of fossil fuel corporations was defended on the grounds that the ads, op-eds, and public appearances discouraging climate action were constitutionally protected forms of expression. We typically consider sourcing our collections from an increasingly small group of media corporations to be a non-political or neutral enough choice. But how does this constrain what is available to our communities? And within this bounded spectrum of views, presenting discredited information and pseudoscience continues in the name of providing balance and neutrality, despite the way consolidated financial and political power weights the scales. It is often remarked that we live in polarized times. Balance and neutrality are understandably seductive concepts. Yet, in a passive stance, this means that we provide balance proportional to the availability dictated by capital instead of balance proportionate to probable accuracy, which favors minority reviews that have monetary backing rather than minority views that come from historically under-resourced marginalized communities. A book doesn't get published, an academic doesn't get funding, an ad campaign is not created without financial backing. 2009 was a low point in public opinion on the reality of climate change in Canada and the Anglosphere. So what happened in the years leading up to it? According to science historians Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway and environmental sociologist Robert Bruhl, the first decade of the 21st century saw oil companies and conservative foundations spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a massive campaign to, quote, manipulate and mislead the public about the threat of climate change by funding a network including advocacy organizations, think tanks, and trade associations, as well as biased research and contrarian experts. Here in Alberta, some of these think tanks, AstroTurf, and nonprofit groups include the Friends of Science, so-called, Ethical Oil, and the Canadian Coalition for Responsible Environmental Solutions. Compounding this problem, individual information seekers face an underavailability of accurate vetted information. A social media meme or a Friends of Science billboard is free to access, whereas peer-reviewed articles or journalistic institutions with higher standards have paywalls or exorbitant subscription costs. Failing to recognize that market logics may pose just as much of a danger as authoritarian logics, or even incorporating market logics into our own institutions, is important to interrogate because our ethical foundations are what differentiates libraries from other information institutions, such as corporations in publishing, tech, or telecommunications. While these private entities are also forms of relationship between communities and knowledges, there exists a different fundamental goal. Even though recent trends have led to the development and symbolic adoption of environmental, social, and governance values in the corporate sector, it has been found that these statements do little to influence actual organizational behavior. I'm not saying necessarily that our traditional tenets are flawed per se, rather that we've got to be mindful of how they accrue to the same power that they are meant to keep in check, and then refine our practice accordingly. Libraries are aspirational institutions driven by their community's use of knowledge as an end, not the means to an end. Library practice should probably remain distinct from the epistemic and axiomatic logics that have justified continued emissions growth, rather than strive for similarity. Perhaps we should be looking for alternatives, finding ways to return the means of knowing to our communities, to explore methods of strengthening the connection between knowledge and acting on it. Working with what we have, such as trust and public space, and acknowledging what we do not have, centrality of discourse, or resources on the scale of the fossil fuel industry and petrostates and social media platforms. This might mean citizen science initiatives like the ones that Vivian Bird has been undertaking in LA, or hosting climate grief workshops, or developing information services for land defenders. It might also mean revisiting assumptions about the way we conceive programs and discovery services. In this workshop, however clumsily, I've attempted to include participation rather than authority, interconnectedness rather than objectivity or neutrality, and relevance, tying these questions back to the cultural, psychological, professional, institutional, and political contexts that you or your community members come from. For our final discussion portion, think about how your library facilitates your community's knowledge of climate change and whether it offers opportunities to act on that knowledge.
All right, Yoa, I'm going to jump in here because we've cut down, we've kind of gone over just a little bit at the end of the 90 minutes. So Unfortunately, I'm not sure we have time to do a breakout. Is that okay, Dan? If you want to
Yep.
just wrap up with closing comments.
Sure. So I'm just a library worker and student from a fairly out of the way part of the world. And my goal here was not to come as an expert on what precisely your institution, its community, and their knowledges need, but to ask questions in order to draw out your own expertise. Kelly Easterling has described the global development of special economic zones as a germ infrastructure that established practices and norms in discrete areas to prototype globalized neoliberalism. And I think maybe libraries can also enact a future tense, establishing an ethical seed in the present that can be nurtured into the worlds we choose to make next. To close out, I want to thank you all for attending and participating and listening to me and each other, as well as the environmental and sustainability section, and particularly Beth and Vivian for inviting me to participate and doing an immense amount of work behind the scenes to make the participatory element possible.
All right. This was so interesting. I'm really glad that we got to have Dan present today, and hope your discussions were great in your breakout rooms. I will definitely be sending out the recording and the slides from today, and hopefully you'll be doing more discussion in your own local communities, and you can reach out to Dan afterwards. We can share his information as well. And the last thing I want to say is we have an upcoming webinar. I put the link in the chat. So if you want to look for the next one, please do. Thank you all. If anyone wants to say anything, please do. But have a great day.